Hi, my name is Jaron. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate from UIUC, and I'll be presenting our findings on the biased mistakes that human moderators make when classifying deepfakes. So today, deepfake profiles are being used to deceive users and achieve malicious goals on a large scale. Just recently, attackers have used deepfake profiles to produce and propagate false narratives with fake journalists, target and connect with high-valued political leaders with fake politicians, and even message potential customers with fake salespersons, causing substantive, real-world harms. In response, social media platforms have largely banned deepfake content, and enforced this by classifying content as either artificial or real through deepfake moderation. And deepfake moderation typically consists of two techniques. Automated moderation, which consists of classifiers that analyze profile information to provide scalable and inexpensive moderation. And manual moderation, in which humans evaluate profiles and content based on a platform's policy to provide a more holistic, contextualized decision, but at a larger cost. And given these trade-offs, most companies actually employ both techniques. While these techniques ideally result in correct classifications, they can also result in incorrect decisions and incorrect enforcements. False negatives are produced when deepfakes are incorrectly classified as real and evade moderation. And false positives are produced when a real user is incorrectly classified as a fake, resulting in direct harm to that individual via content removal or account bans. Combining both of these, researchers have begun to investigate how different deepfake moderation techniques contribute to errors. In the space of automated moderation, a large branch of literature has investigated how to detect deepfakes with deep learning techniques. However, this has broadly resulted in an arms race. Increasingly, industry is also beginning to pay more attention to who gets incorrectly moderated, finding racial and other forms of identity-based biases in existing algorithms. However, in contrast to these automated moderation techniques, little work has investigated the efficacy of manual human moderation. In the space of deepfake detection, Nightingale has found that deepfake faces are often more trusted than real faces, and Mink et al. Has found that even if errors are placed in full deepfake social media profiles, these profiles are still often able to evade human detection. Additionally, both works have found evidence that these errors might be influenced by racial and gender stereotypes that human moderators hold. However, no work has investigated whether these mistakes are actually made on real social media profiles, or whether real social media profiles are disproportionately harmed based on their identity. Thus, we ask, how do people misidentify real social media profiles? And is there disproportional harm to certain identity groups? More specifically, we ask two research questions. First, how do certain factors influence moderation errors of real profiles among people? These factors include the gender and racial identity of the profile owner, whether the moderator holds the same identity as the profile, and the specific profile components that are shown and visible. Second, how do moderators make these incorrect profile decisions in the first place? So to answer these questions, we run a mixed methods user study, and in this study, we ask participants to be moderators, determining whether several profiles are either real or artificial. Each participant first received a brief background, defining deepfakes, and were then asked to review some LinkedIn profiles. Participants then determined whether 23 LinkedIn profiles were either real or artificial. However, unknown to the participants, all profiles were actually real human LinkedIn profiles. As a result, all profiles rated as artificial were actually false positives. And there's an important bit of nuance here. We are not trying to evaluate the prevalence of these false positives. We're trying to see whether any particular identity group is disproportionately assigned these false positives. So to accustom participants to the task, we begin by asking them to review 5 randomly selected profiles, and for each profile, determining whether they agree or disagree that the profile is artificial via a Likert scale. For the next 18 profiles, we then carefully select a set of profiles to investigate whether biases are at play. Specifically, we apply 3 controlled conditions to each profile. First, we investigate whether profile identity has an effect by having profiles be owned by a person with one of 6 self-selected intersectional identities. They either self-identify as a man or woman and self-identify as black, white, or not singularly black or white. We chose to evaluate this set of identities based on prior work, which finds differences in viewers' perceived warmness, artificiality, and self-reported incidents of moderation, among others. However, to ensure that participants don't only see people who identify as black or white, and thus infer the purpose of the study might be identity-based, We also include profiles that do not singularly identify as black or white. These profiles are only used to minimize social desirability bias, and as a result, we don't attempt to analyze them. Second, each moderator also either holds the same identity as the profile and is an in-group, or differs from that identity and is an out-group. Third, we investigate how showing different profile content may also affect this bias. Each participant either saw all profiles with all content, or just the image and name, or just the About section. Going back to our moderation task, within these 18 profiles, we show 3 profiles for each identity. We show 3 profiles that are in-grouped and 15 that are out-grouped from the moderator's identity. And we show 1 set of profile content for the entire survey. After rating these profiles, participants then report their reasoning for their ratings on 6 different profiles. We ensure that 1 profile from each identity is shown to them. Lastly, participants finish the survey by reporting their demographics. As a whole, we recruit 695 participants to act as moderators, and these participants were equally divided among our identities of interest. As noted, all profiles shown in this survey were as authentic as possible while maintaining owner anonymity. We used real profile images, about text, and an owner-selected pseudonym whose gender and racial identity matches their real identity. We deeply thought about the ethical considerations related to this and made a series of intentional choices. We fully detail these considerations in our paper. In total, we collect 160 real profiles with at least 25 per studied identity. Before our results, as a team, we want to highlight our positionality. As researchers working within usable security, we are increasingly observant of the ways that identity-based biases can have impacts, and thus we set out with the intentions to minimize these differences. Our team holds expertise in human perceptions of generated content, security and privacy concerns of marginalized groups, and the psychology of stereotyping and prejudice. And as a team, we also hold a diverse set of gender and racial identities. However, important to this paper, our team does not contain any black women, and thus there are lived experiences that our positionality does not reflect. With that in mind, let's move on to our results by investigating how profile identity, moderator identity, and profile content affect moderation errors. First, we find that all controlled factors affect perceived artificiality. We run a cumulative link mixed effects regression to model our data, and we model the perceived artificiality of each profile as our dependent variable. Each controlled factor is then assigned as a fixed effect upon this variable. After fitting and testing this model, we find several significant factors and bold them below. First, we find that for each of our primary factors, they significantly affect the perceived artificiality. However, we also find that each identity also interacts with what content is also being shown at the time. Thus, in order to properly interpret these results, we have to look at how these identities affect artificiality in the context of specific profile content. First, we find that profiles with the same identity as the moderator are perceived as less artificial. Let's begin by looking at our results with just the image and name. By plotting our Likert agreement and by placing a red box around those who believe that the profile was artificial, we can see some trends. First, we find that profiles that are an in-group of the moderator identity are perceived as significantly less artificial than those that are out-group. However, when moderators view the full profile, we don't see any significant differences. And interestingly enough, this is also the case for text-only profiles. And as a whole, this might imply that when identity-laden components are emphasized, moderators are more likely to believe in-group profiles are real compared to out-group profiles. Moving on to specific identities, we find that biases against profile identities exist. In particular, when looking at just the image and the name. Compared to the profiles of white women and white men, black women are perceived as significantly less artificial. Similarly, compared to white women and white men, black men are also perceived as significantly less artificial. However, when moderators view the full profile, we find that many of these biases are lessened or removed, only finding significant differences between the profiles of black women and white men. And for text only, we find no differences between any identities. Thus, similar to moderator identity, we find that emphasizing identity-based components causes disparate impact among profile identities. Additionally, if we group the same data in a different way, we can investigate how content affects artificiality for different identities. And in particular, we find that only black identities are affected by content changes. So just looking at the profiles of black women and black men, we find that compared to text profiles, including the image and name decreases the perceived artificiality of the profile. However, when looking at the profiles of white women, we see no differences of artificiality among content. And this similarly holds for white men. Thus, this may imply that compared to the profiles of white identities, the profiles of black identities are uniquely considered when determining artificiality. Next, when investigating people's qualitative responses, we discover people's reasonings when making moderation decisions. Through thematic analysis, we find that participants hold several mental models when determining if a profile is artificial. Some participants rely on unspoken intuition and gut instinct. Others rely on their worldview, their perception of AI functionality, and their belief of attacker strategies. And while we have interesting insights on all of these, due to time we'll only be able to cover 2. First, we find that biased worldviews lead to several false positives. Participants often relied on their expectations of real profiles and people and determined whether a profile deviated or aligned with that. Several participants considered whether the LinkedIn profile was acting in line with professional standards of the site. For instance, one participant noted that the photo someone used was unusual for LinkedIn, and as ideas of professionalism are heavily related to culture and identity, such beliefs may cause bias. Even more directly, some participants comment on skills, behaviors, and appearances that are common for careers. However, this directly draws on stereotypes widely known to be intertwined with identity-based beliefs. Lastly, some participants directly ground their reasoning in identity-based stereotypes themselves. For instance, one participant notes that they believe that it's strange for a profile of a black man to be named Adam and is thus a sign of artificiality. However, some participants also believe that if a profile follows stereotypes too closely, they may also be artificial. For instance, one participant believes that it's stereotypical for a black man to be named Brock and thus draws suspicion. Thus, regardless of whether individuals actually follow these stereotypes, groups that are more heavily associated with stereotypes may be more likely to experience this type of bias. Additionally, participants also note how personal experiences have altered their worldviews. For instance, one person notes that an empty profile is actually quite common for young students, as they themselves were once a student, and that this might imply that participants who hold diverse experiences may also hold more accurate representations of what personas are real. We also find that perceptions of expected AI functionality, or what deepfakes do or do not produce, tend to lead to false positives. Perhaps most interestingly, we find that users' understanding of existing algorithmic biases lead to their own moderation biases. Participants noted that algorithms may be biased and poorly represent certain identities. Thus, seeing a realistic profile of such an identity is considered to be less likely to be artificially generated. For example, upon seeing a realistic profile of a black person, one participant notes that AI has a hard time with black features, implying that this profile is likely real. More generally, participants' perceptions of AI competence often led them to believe that high-quality or low-quality profiles were artificial. However, they often disagreed of which should be artificial. For instance, one participant notes that a profile is too perfectly structured and doesn't have any mistakes, a clear sign of an algorithm. However, another participant notes that a profile appears to be rambling, another clear sign of an algorithm. Thus, it's unclear whether any profile can be wholly trusted. Lastly, the anthropomorphization of AI has led to some personalities to be considered more artificial than others. In particular, profiles that feel like they are imbued with emotion or discuss topics related to personal life often appear as more human, in contrast to AI's cold, logical, and fact-driven nature. As a result, certain human personalities may be more likely to be considered artificial. Based on these findings, there are a number of implications. For platforms trying to moderate artificial content, we ask them to consider and account for human biases during moderation. More specifically, we recommend de-emphasizing identity-related components to prevent disparate outcomes, and ensuring the diversity of lived experiences among moderation teams. For AI designers, we re-emphasize the importance of reducing bias. We find that the very real biases of AI systems also cause harm through the perception of bias during moderation. Thus, we join the call of many before us to de-bias AI systems and remove biased systems from deployment. For educators, we recommend avoiding stereotyping for both AI and attackers. In both of these, we find concrete evidence that anthropomorphizing AI and strictly assuming the social engineering techniques can result in biases of specific personalities and appearances online. Thank you so much for listening.